When we're asked the question, what is the first and the greatest commandment, what answer are we most likely to give? I'll throw the question open to the audience. What comes to your mind when the question's asked, what is the first and the greatest commandment? Love the Lord thy God. That's correct. That's the answer we expect to hear. And what's the second one? Love thy neighbour as thyself. Jesus, of course, was the one who said that, wasn't he, to the people that, the lawyer and the scribe that asked him what is the greatest commandment. There's more than one occasion in Scripture where that question was asked, and in both occasions Jesus said the same thing. Greatest and first and greatest commandment, to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul and mind, and the second is like unto it, love thy neighbour as thyself. And so we could have a look at that in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 35. Where the question was asked to Jesus, Matthew chapter 22. Verse 35. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him, and saying, Master, which is the greatest commandment of the law, in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And this is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. And so the question I've asked, and I asked myself over a year ago now, because when Brother Jim was looking for Bible class subjects, I gave him a couple, and this was one that I'd been thinking about for some time. The question was, well, if that's the case, why did Jesus need to give a new commandment, which is what we've read there in John 13? Because one would expect that such a commandment was already basically in place. If that was the second of the great commandments of the law, that we love our neighbour as ourselves, well, embodied in that is to love one another. Why did Jesus need to do that? And we've read that in John chapter 13, which you might still have your finger in there, in verse 33. Little children, yet a little while I am with you. Ye shall seek me, and as I said unto the Jews, whither I go ye cannot come. So now I say to you, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you. That ye also love one another. And he repeated again in chapter 15. If you just turn over to chapter 15 and verse 12, he says, This is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. So we've looked at Matthew chapter 22 and also where Jesus said that. So we looked in John 13, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another as I have loved you. And you might see the emphasis I've placed on those last words, as I have loved you. These are the points that I'd like to cover in our class tonight. Hopefully we won't go over time. Israel were never commanded to love God. I hope to prove these points as we go along, and you may have questions. You may not agree with some of these, I'm not sure. But anyway, Israel were never commanded to love God. Moses emphasised the underlying principles in the Ten Commandments. So to love God from the heart and to treat one's fellow man in a way that we would desire that they should treat us we will see were the two underlying principles of the law, which Jesus, of course, quoted. 3, we'll show that what God desired of his people was their sincerest gratitude and love from the heart, so making the 10 Commandments almost redundant and unnecessary. We will also show that Jesus' commandment was in every sense new. It did not restate an old one. We'll show that the new commandment has less to do with emotional and sentimental love and all to do with the self-sacrificing service to our brethren and sisters in the household of God. We'll see that to love your neighbour as yourself is not even remotely close to loving your neighbour in the way Jesus commanded his disciples, as I have loved you. 7th, we'll see that the disciples, Peter particularly, had a great challenge in the level of service demanded by Jesus, which at the Last Supper, which we've read briefly of there in John 13, they didn't comprehend. They had no idea, really, at this stage what was facing Jesus. Even only a few hours' time, it wasn't till after the event was over that they realised what had happened. And the last point, we'll see that our lives as members of God's house and his sons and daughters demands of us a life of sacrifice, and that is that our lives become a living sacrifice. And if we are obedient to Jesus' command to love one another as I have loved you, then our lives will become, in obedience to that, not an option, but a commandment, a living sacrifice. Now, our first point then, which we will go back to, is to remember that Israel, well, they were not commanded to love God because they were brought out of Egypt, as you know. They were brought out of slavery. They'd been delivered through the Red Sea. They'd witnessed the destruction of Egypt's armies. They'd been provided with bread from heaven, the manna, and they'd been given water in the wilderness. And they also witnessed, as they travelled, they saw the cloud by day and the fire by night. And so after 3 short months of all of those things happening, they're now at Sinai, in the Sinai desert, in the wilderness, before Mount Sinai. And Moses prepared them to hear God's word. So if you turn to Exodus 20, we'll have a look to see what they heard. They heard God speaking, of course. It's hard to perhaps imagine that all of these people, and there were 600,000 men besides women and children, we're told, who are assembled at the base of the mount, who witness incredible events before their face. If we have a look at chapter 19, in verse 9, as we've got there on the screen, it says, "And Yahweh said to Moses, Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee, and believe thee forever." And Moses told the words of the people, the words of Yahweh unto the people. And then in chapter 19 and verse 19, we read, "And when the voice of the trumpet sounded long and waxed louder and louder, Moses spake, and God answered him by a voice. And Yahweh came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mount, and Yahweh called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up." And so we read that the people actually heard the voice of Yahweh. So if we go over to chapter 20, verse 6, we'll probably from verse 5, we'll have a look at what they actually heard. We'll start from verse 3. These are the words of the voice that they heard. "I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, Yahweh thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. And so on. And so if we go to verse 7, the third of the commandments, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. In verse 8, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In verse 12, honour thy father and thy mother. And then in verses 13 to 16, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour. And verse 17, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's anything. So what we see there in verse 6 particularly, if you go back to verse 6, verses 5 and 6, let's read that again. God says to them, and they hear this voice coming down, booming out, obviously, of people are very fearful actually. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, Yahweh thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. That's what God was offering to them. If you keep my commandments, if you love me, then I will bless you. I'll show mercy unto you. And so when we read those carefully, if you see the ones that are highlighted there, they're the 10 Commandments, right? They learn those. And what you see is that there's 3 there concerning our relationship, our respect of Yahweh, to realise that we shall have no other gods before him, that we will not make a graven image, and so on. So there's 3 there concerning our relationship to God. And then there's 5 at the end, which are a relationship to our neighbour, to our man next door, to our brother, to our other human friends or relations or people. So there's 8 out of 10 commandments there that are telling us what not to do. And that's what they heard. And they are the 10 Commandments. Now, you won't find there any commandment that says, thou shalt love me. God didn't command them to love him. He commanded them to obey him. It was Moses, we find, that interpreted that and says in Deuteronomy chapter 10, let's go over to it. Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 18. Moses is telling, this is at the end of his life, by the way, pretty much. So this is 38 years later, or nearly 40 years later actually, 40 years later, that Moses is now speaking to the people. And so he states 2 fundamental principles that are required from the law that God had given them back at Sinai, which we've read there in Exodus 20. In verse 12, Deuteronomy 10 verse 12, he says, and now Israel, what doth Yahweh thy God require of thee? But to fear Yahweh thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve Yahweh thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes which I command thee this day for thy good. And then if we go over to verses 18 and 19, love therefore, he doth execute the judgment of the father, speaking about God, he doth execute the judgment of the fatherless and widow, and loves the stranger in giving him food and raiment. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. So what we see in this is that the 10 Commandments were given. They heard it, and it was very plain what they were saying. Don't make graven images, don't believe in other gods, don't serve other gods, and do to your neighbour what basically you would have them do unto you. They were the 2 fundamental things. There's 8 out of 10 of those were thou shalt nots. There was only 2 commandments out of the 10 that were positive commandments in the sense that of keeping the Sabbath, because it was God's day of rest. God had rested on the Sabbath. It was something that was a positive. God could see the Sabbath keeping as a very important day of rest for the people as well, particularly from their own labours when it came later on to the establishment of the law, so they could serve God that day. And also the other positive one was to honour thy father and thy mother. So they were 2 positive commandments there, whereas the others we might call them negative commandments because they were thou shalt nots. Now if you think that is therefore that that they had to love God and they had to love their neighbour, as Jesus reminds them, then why do you need those 8 negative commandments? If you were thankful, having been brought out of Egypt and witnessed what they'd done, and come there and being saved from slavery, the last hundreds of years, slavery in Egypt, you've seen Pharaoh's armies destroyed in the Red Sea, you saw the Red Sea open, that's all witness at a few months ago. And now God's speaking to you and saying to that, why would you not love God from the heart, like Moses says here in Deuteronomy? That's what God wants from you. He wants you to be thankful for what he's done for you and what he's doing for you and what he has planned for you. And of course, every faithful Israelite who heard that wouldn't have needed those first 3 commandments for a start, because they love God. And that's what God desired from them. And that was the fundamental principle in the law. God desired that the Israelites would love him, but he didn't command it. The promise of blessing was there if they did from their heart. And if they did, then the 10 commandments were basically redundant. Now, what sort of love are we talking about here? I know some of you, of course, will say, well, hang on. We know that we often make a big story about Agape in the New Testament, which is what we read in John 13, and Phileo, which is a different type of love. Well, in the Hebrew, there is no 2 words for love. There's 1 word for love in Hebrew. And that 1 word for love is the word Ahab. Funny name, but anyway, that's it, Ahab. And it's used right through the Old Testament with no distinction with the type of love we're talking about. So the word that's used here when Moses says to love the Lord, to love him, is that Hebrew word. And it's used elsewhere. In Genesis 22 verse 2 is the first occasion in the Old Testament where that word for love is used, and that's where it says Abraham loved Isaac. What sort of love are we talking about? We're talking about a love of his father for his son, and Abraham loved him. In Genesis 27 verse 4, the same word is used again. It says Isaac loved venison. What sort of love is that? He liked eating that meat. It was what he loved. In Genesis 29, Jacob loved Rachel. What sort of love is that? Well, it's the same word as what it says back there in Exodus 20. And the first mention of loving God is in Exodus 20 verse 6, where we read the same word again. So there's only that 1 Hebrew word for all those examples. It occurs 212 times in the Old Testament. And it's translated as love, loveth, beloved, lovers, friends, lovest, loving, friend, lover, loved and lovely, and there might be some more. But They're all the same Hebrew word. And so when we realise that this is actually what God is requiring of them, and what Moses is picking up from that is that God wants from us an emotional response. We're not talking about sacrificial, rigorous love of, academic variety. We're talking about an emotional love that God actually wants from us. He wants us to be thankful. He wanted Israel to be thankful for what he had done for them in delivering them. And I think we can understand that. And I mean, we should have the same response ourselves, because what's God done to us? He's called us out of Egypt, spiritual, and he has provided a way of salvation towards his kingdom for us. We know we don't deserve it, neither did Israel. We know we don't deserve it. It's by God's grace and by his calling and by his wisdom. What's our response? It should be simply to love God. Not to think, oh, well, I can't do this and I can't do that and I mustn't do this. It's a completely positive response that God desires from us. And so, same from Israel. And therefore, 8 out of 10 commandments, I argue, are really, to the faithful Israelite, totally redundant, totally unnecessary. So why was the law with all its things added? Well, we're told that in Galatians 3 verse 19. We're told why the law was added. It was added because of transgression. In other words, the law was given for unlawful people, for people who go against what God desires. And so you had to put a law in place for the unrighteous, for the transgressions, for the wickedness of people. So God puts that in place because inevitably, of course, that's what happened. And so our third point, that the law of love was really not a commandment but a response. And so we see here that the love of God from the heart and love of one's neighbour are two fundamental principles contained in the commandments given to Israel. If those two principles had been adopted, I should put it up for you, shouldn't I? If those two principles had been adopted by Israel, then 8 out of the 10 commandments, thou shalt not commandments, would have been unnecessary. Why then the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come to whom the promises were made, and it was ordained by angels in the hand of a mediator. So brings us on to the fourth point, which is the new commandment is in fact new. And I remember asking this question some time back, one meeting we had, and I said, why did Jesus give a new commandment? And one of the answers that was given was, well, it wasn't a new commandment because Jesus had already basically stated what the commandments are, to love God and to love your neighbour. So it wasn't really a new commandment at all. It was just restating an old one. And that was, some believe that to be the case. So I'd like to show you that it was a new commandment, and particularly from the Greek. That's a wine bottle, and you know what you don't do with old wine bottles. You don't put new wine into them because the skins break as the wine matures and ferments or whatever. So Jesus said in one of his parables, you only put new wine into new bottles. And he wasn't talking about renewed wine, he was talking about new wine, and he wasn't talking about old bottles that have been cleaned or restored or whatever. He was talking about completely brand new bottles. And that Greek word that's used there is that Greek word kainos. It occurs 44 times in the New Testament, and it means absolutely what it says. It means new. Not old, not restored, new. And so some examples in Matthew 9 verse 17, we've got that one, the new bottles. In Matthew 26:28, it speaks about a new covenant, brand new covenant. Matthew 27, verse 60, Jesus was put into a new tomb that had never been used. Mark 1, they said, what is this new doctrine that Jesus is preaching? In Revelation 3:12, it speaks of a new Jerusalem. Not an old one restored, but a brand new one. And of course, we understand that to be the vision of Christ and the saints. So there's a new covenant. And so we should take it literally, what Jesus said, a new commandment. And a new commandment means that Jesus was, at this closing hour of his ministry, setting in concrete a new commandment to, now we get the Greek word, agape one another. The Greek word there for love is agape. Our fifth point is Jesus' picture of Jesus giving the new commandment. They're all sitting around the table because this was at the Last Supper, you recall. And it is a commandment. Who's missing? Judas, that's right, because as we read there in the reading, Judas had just gone out. Remember, we'll go back to it a little later. Jesus washed their feet. He washed all of them, Peter included, and Judas, but Judas went out to go and betray the Lord. The others didn't have a clue why he was going out, but he went out, and after he'd gone out, Jesus then takes the others, the 11 faithful disciples, and he gives them this new commandment. Whoops, it's a bit slow, this computer. Okay. The point 5 that I'd like to make is that the new commandment, therefore, demands an unconditional sacrifice. The Greek word for love is agapeo. It's the most common word used in the New Testament to describe the outworking or consequence of an emotional or sentimental love. So what we've got to be careful we don't do with agape is to divorce it from emotional love. Can't do that. Because as we read through the New Testament, we find that the word agapeo is used mostly for love in all its forms. And if you think about that, if you emotionally love somebody, which is really a different word, that word filio, the brotherly love type, then if you really emotionally are attached or love somebody, then you're going to sacrifice for them, aren't you? We do that every day for those we love. It's a sacrifice of our own will and desires very often for the sake of our partner, our husband, our wife, our children, whatever it might be. There's a very strong tie between emotional and sacrificial love, and therefore it's artificial really to separate those two. But there is an occasion where brotherly love is separated from agape, and we'll see that because it shows up towards the end of our study. So agape is the common word used most often in the New Testament to describe the outworking of emotional love. It does not necessarily have to be motivated by a personal emotional attachment, though. Agape can be used without the emotional part of it. We'll see that. And we can illustrate this from Jesus' words at the beginning of his ministry as he established the basis of his new teaching. He wrote he said on the Sermon on the Mount, he said, "It's written, thou shalt not, but I say." And he draws out two underlying principles of love that Moses declared to Israel. In chapter 6, verse 32, what have we got there? Yeah, 6, verse 32. "If ye love them which love you, what thanks have you? For sinners also love those that love them." Now, Jesus is speaking about to people who are going to be his disciples, those who follow him. And he says, you've got to love your neighbour, you've got to love your enemy even. But he says, if you just love those that love you, then you're not any better than the sinners, because they all do that. Everybody does that. So what's special about that? Nothing at all. In Luke 14, you might like to turn to that one or read it. Luke 14 verses 12 to 14. Similar statement. Jesus was speaking to them about taking the pride of place and so on, and he said, well, don't push yourself forward too much. And then in verse 12 he says to them, as he was having supper with one of the Pharisees, I think it was, then he said also to him that bade him, when you make a dinner or a supper, call not thy friends nor thy brethren, neither thy kinsmen nor thy rich neighbours, lest they also bid thee again, and recompense be made thee. But when thou makest a feast, call the poor, the maimed, the blind, the lame, and thou shalt be blessed, for they cannot recompense thee, for thou shalt be recompensed at the resurrection of the just. You'll notice on the screen there that the word love in verse 6 is agape, right? So when we say that agape means sacrificial love, it does for sinners as well, because sinners also sacrifice for their loved ones, as we do. That word's agape. When you go down to verse of chapter 14, Luke 14, the word friends there is phileo, and that has a slightly different sense. It's translated quite often in the Bible as love as well, in about 40 odd places. It's translated as love as well, so we don't see the distinction in the English so much. But this is sort of more or less a friendship, a more casual relationship between two people who are friends. Brotherly love, it can be sort of reasonably casual. And he says, don't call your best friends, the people that you associate with. He says, call the ones that can't offer you a recompense. And so Jesus required of his disciples a sacrifice of love for those that we have no emotional or sentimental love for. So those people that Jesus says you call them, you show the Spirit by calling those people who are blind, lame, the dropouts down in the street. They're the ones I want you to call. They're the ones that I want you to show love to, not your friends, because that's no sacrifice at all. And so he wants us to be able to show that sort of a spirit to those that we don't have any natural filial love for necessarily. Even the people that we may sometimes consider rather contemptible, as they would have. Some of those Pharisees would have considered those that Jesus lives are quite contemptible. And yet Jesus says they're the ones that you're going to ask, because they can't recompense you. They'll never give you anything back. And that's the sort of spirit that Jesus wants from us, brothers and sisters, young people as well. He doesn't want us to do everything out of love that we might get a return for, a recompense for, because he says your recompense will be at the judgment seat in the day when Christ comes. And so I think the greatest sacrifice that we can make will be to those for whom we have absolutely no affection or a filial love for. The greater our affection for a person, filial, the less the agape, the less the sacrifice. And if you think about that, you make a sacrifice, a husband makes sacrifice every day for his wife. Wife makes bigger sacrifice every day for her husband because she looks after him far, far better than he looks after her. But it's a pleasure to do that, isn't it? This is love. It's a pleasure. It's not a sacrifice at all. Well, it is a sacrifice, but you don't see it that way. But if you were doing that for somebody you didn't really love, that's a bigger sacrifice. It's harder to do. See, it's not natural. It's not the natural thing that Jesus is asking them to do. When he says love one another, he's not necessarily speaking about an affection in that sense, because we'll see that it was as I have loved you, and that's really the key to this question. So just going back over that for briefly, we see that the Greek word agape does not differentiate between sacrificial love and emotional love, and the context entirely defines what the meaning of the word is, whether it be one or the other. Now the next point we make is that the old commandment that was given to Israel was to love one another as yourself. That's the way that Moses basically condensed it, to love God and to love your neighbour as yourself. Now you think about that, we all say, yeah, we've got to love our neighbours as ourselves. We quote that all the time, don't we? Well, here's a question. Do you love yourself? A bit hard question, you know. What happens when somebody's a bit of a peacock, you know, like in the picture there, and they got the vanity mirror out and their hair, and it's a vanity mirror, by the way. And what do we say? Well, what do we say about somebody that's always trying to put themselves forward? Trying to always be up there, one better than everybody else, quite often, particularly in a public situation. What do we say? Or don't we? Don't we say, oh, he loves himself? And is that a compliment? I don't think so. It's sort of really not a compliment at all. People who love themselves are quite often sort of put down in our eyesight a bit. We really regard humility and people not putting themselves forward as being something rather more attractive, don't we? We like people who are humble. So how do we love ourselves? That's what it says. To love your neighbour as yourself. What does it really mean? Because we don't think we should really love ourselves so much. Well, I think it's pretty obvious what it really means, and that is that the law required you to treat another person as you would have them treat you. So, you're not going to kill your neighbour. Would you kill yourself? Normally, no. People don't normally do that, although these days it's quite an epidemic, but you don't go killing yourself. You try to preserve your own life. You do that for your neighbour. You wouldn't do that. Would you steal from yourself some way? Would you sort of deprive yourself deliberately? No. You wouldn't want to do that to your neighbour, would you? You wouldn't want to steal his wife or his goods or whatever if you were doing the right thing by your neighbour. And so you see, to love yourself really means to say treat your neighbour as you would treat yourself, or at least as you would have them treat you. But it doesn't really mean that you've got to love everybody. It just means you've got to treat them in a way which is respectful of their human rights, I suppose we might call it that, mightn't we? So they had under the law, whatever, the way we treat them is the way we'd like them to treat us. And so to love yourself is not quite the same as this one. To love one another, not as yourself, but as I have loved you. And here's the big difference in the new commandment. Jesus said to Peter, remember, Jesus was forewarning the disciples that his crucifixion was coming up in the next day or two, a few days it was coming up. And he said, I'm going to be crucified and going to be taken by wicked men and slain. And Peter says, oh, be it far from thee, Lord. And what did Jesus do? He turned around, he said, get thee behind me, Satan, didn't he? Get behind me, Satan. And because you're an offence to me. And that was quite a sharp rebuke, wasn't it, that Jesus gave to Peter when he opposed Jesus for what he was about to do, which was going to give his life in a cruel death for the sins of the world, basically, for our redemption. Peter said, be it far from thee. He couldn't get his head around that at all. Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. And then later on in Matthew 16, verse 24, Jesus said to his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. It wasn't save yourself, it was deny himself. And we get into the spirit of what really Jesus was doing. Jesus was in complete rejection of his own natural feelings in this case. He was going to deny himself and he was going to go ahead with that. And so in Matthew 16:25 he says, for whosoever will save his life shall lose it, and whosoever will lose his life for my sake shall find. And Jesus was giving the example really of what was going to happen. He was about to give his life in a final act of sacrificial love. It was a sacrifice, and it became the ultimate example of dedication to the will of God. He says, as I have loved you. Now, the disciples didn't understand that when he said it. It's only after. Remember that John, the record, is written after the crucifixion. He's going back and giving us through the Spirit what happened on that night. So the record in John is being written down after the event. And of course they understood it by then. They had come to understand that. That new commandment, therefore, is presenting us with a huge challenge. Now, we go back to John 13. You might like to just turn back to it again, just for a moment. Because at the beginning, at this beginning of this sequence of events, when that final command's given by Jesus, Jesus washed the disciples' feet. There's a picture there of Jesus washing their feet, and they're embarrassed by that. Why would they be embarrassed, do you think? Any ideas? Why would they be embarrassed by that? Yes, it was the work of a servant. In fact, it was probably the work of a slave. Even more than a disciple. They would have been absolutely embarrassed by what Jesus was doing. He suddenly girds himself, he bends down there and he starts washing their feet. An absolute no-no as far as the disciples would have been concerned. And there's a little quote down there which you can't read, right at the bottom, which you're really not meant to. It was a really reminder to me, and I can't read it either. It says, Luke 17, gird thyself and serve me, till I have eaten and drunken, and afterward thou shalt eat. Now that was one of the lessons that Jesus, one of the parables, and he was speaking about the unprofitable servant as we are. And the master sitting down at the table, the servant comes in, the slave, he is actually a slave, and the master's sitting there, and the poor slave comes in, he's tired, he's dirty, he's everything, and the master says, get my tea. And the slave goes and gets the tea, and that's what they expected. You go and get your tea, my tea, and then after I've eaten and everything, then you can have yours. Okay, that's the deal. And that's what slaves got. And that's what they were embarrassed for, because Jesus, who is their master, who is their great leader and the one they all look up to and highly respect is bending down doing a servant's job of washing their feet. And they couldn't grasp that at all. And so in verse 7 there, if you've got it open, it says, Jesus said to them, Peter said firstly, as he would, you're not going to wash my feet. Do you wash my feet? Peter was staggered. Jesus answered and said to him in verse 7, what I do thou knowest not now. You don't know what I'm doing now, Peter. But, he says, you shall know hereafter. You see, Peter had no idea that Jesus was going to be crucified the next day. None of the disciples here, the women knew, but the disciples who were with Jesus had not realised how far that sacrifice was going. They didn't appreciate what had happened. And Jesus knew they didn't understand it in verse 7. You don't know what I'm doing now, but you will later. But thou shalt know hereafter. The disciples were embarrassed. They could not comprehend what Jesus had done. To have the master wash the servant's feet was unthinkable. They could not understand it, but Jesus said they would. We also understand that they had not grasped the fact that Jesus was soon to be crucified, therefore could not yet comprehend fully the significance of Jesus' new command, which he gave just shortly after. Judas goes out and then he continues on after he washed their feet and he gives them that new commandment, as I have loved you. He's already working on it. Washing the disciples' feet, he's already working on it. He's giving them the demonstration. He's showing them what you do. He's showing them what you expect. And then he gives the new commandment. He says, as I have loved you. But they still don't understand that. They haven't got the message yet that Jesus is going to give his life for them. He's going to be crucified. And after they did understand it, of course, but now they don't. And so when he gives them the new commandment, as I have loved you, it still hadn't really understood what he meant by that. What does I have loved you? What does that mean? Well, Jesus' example of service and sacrifice would only be fully comprehended after it had been completed. Until he had been crucified, raised from the dead, and they had realised what he was saying, would they fully comprehend it. And so when that happened, after the resurrection, all of those things suddenly became clear to the disciples. They understood what he was saying. Now we understand what he was saying. He has commanded us to humbly serve one another, and furthermore we've been commanded to sacrifice our own lives for one another. That's what Jesus has commanded, and it's not an option. It's not an option like it was in the old law, when God said, well, these are what you're not allowed to do, and I'd love you to love me, and if you love me, you won't do that anyway. But it wasn't commanded. There was no command there to love. But here, it's what it says. I command that. So therefore, brethren and sisters, we don't have an option about this. It's a command to sacrifice our lives for one another. And so Peter, who was one who protested when Jesus said he was going to be crucified, be it far from thee, Lord. Peter, who said, you're not going to wash my feet, Lord. And then he says at the end of chapter 13 there, Jesus said to him, Peter said to him, Lord, why can't I follow thee? He said, I'll lay down my life for thee. Jesus said to him, will you lay down your life for my sake? Verily I say unto you, the cock will not crow till you've denied me 3 times. And Peter did. We know the story. Peter denied his Lord 3 times. And he was brought to remember that, wasn't he? So Jesus said to them, as I have loved you. Just going briefly back, agape occurs 142 times in the Bible, in the New Testament. The word agape is the word that Jesus used. He doesn't use the word phileo because phileo is simply a friendly attachment. It doesn't have the depth or the meaning of agape. And agape, remember, is also emotional, but it's also sacrificial. And the two of them can't really be separated. Phileo, on the other hand, is a word that only occurs, 25 times in the New Testament, and it always has an emotional context describing the sort of love which is experienced in a close personal relationship between friends or family. It is never used in the sacrificial sense, as is agape. So they're the two words. And it's clear from the context of John 21 that Peter now fully comprehends the difference between agape and phileo. So let's have a look at John 21. John 21 verse 15. So they'd had a meal with Jesus after the resurrection. Jesus had eaten with them. And in verse 15, when they had dined, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of Jonah, lovest thou me more than these?" Why do you think Jesus picked on Peter to ask him 3 questions 3 times? Why did he pick on Peter? 3 times he questioned him. You know, don't you? Because 3 times he denied his master. And 3 times Jesus says to him, "You love me?" And what's the word Jesus uses there? It's the word agape, of course, as it is through the New Testament anyway. It's a sacrificial and emotional attachment, but it's very, very much sacrificial in the sense of you give your life for someone, as Jesus has loved us. He's given his life for us. So he says to Peter, "You love me more than these?" And Peter says, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." And what's the word that Peter uses? It's in the green up there. It's not agape. He's not going to use it. Peter knows exactly what Jesus said back there when he says, "Love me," but he doesn't use it. He uses phileo. "You know, Lord, that I'm a friend of yours. I greatly respect you. I love you," but not agape. He said to him, "Feed my lambs." Then he asked him again. Said to him again the second time, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Agape me?" Peter said, You know I phileo you, Lord. You know I do. Feed my sheep." The third time Jesus says to him, "Simon, son of Jonah, do you even phileo me?" Can you imagine how Peter felt? Jesus questioned me whether even is a friend of his. You can imagine how Peter felt. Peter was grieved because he said unto him the third time, "You even my friend, Peter? Do you love me?" And he said unto him, "Lord, you know all things. Thou knowest that I love thee." And that was phileo again. Jesus said unto him, "Feed my sheep." So poor Peter, he got put through the mill. But he understood what Jesus had said when he gave them the new commandment: love one another as I have loved you. You will be my disciples. And Peter understood the depth of that sacrifice that Jesus was requiring of them. And so, brethren and sisters, in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 18 to 25, Peter's addressing slaves there. In 1 Peter 3, he's addressing especially the faithful slaves, the ones who'd actually accepted the gospel and were baptised into Christ. And they were daily subjected to humiliation and unjust practices by their employers. They were slaves, they had no rights. And Jesus, at least Peter, is telling them to basically serve their masters faithfully and to consider Jesus' example and, like him, suffer wrongful treatment as patiently as Jesus did. And he says to them, if you do that, if you slaves do that and work to your master as to the Lord and even suffer wrongfully as Jesus had done, then he says, well, you were like sheep going astray, but now are returned to the shepherd and bishop of your souls, being brought back into the fold. And that's what Jesus came to do, didn't he? He came to save the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and they were a lot of slaves as well. And he says, you were like sheep going astray. And what was Peter doing? He was feeding the sheep. So you see, Peter got the message, and Peter did give his life. Peter, in fact, was believed was crucified the same as his Lord. And he did exactly what Jesus had commanded. And he did it willingly and no doubt with great love for those that he was saving. And so the new commandment was given at the end of Jesus' ministry, because it was only then that the apostles could understand and comprehend the depth of meaning and how fundamental it would be in their future roles in preaching the gospel and what else they did. They too would suffer death as followers of their Lord, and they too sacrificed their lives in obedience to the new commandment to love one another as I have loved you. So after 3.5 years of providing an unrelenting example of self-sacrifice, Jesus performed one penultimate act to demonstrate just how far self-sacrifice must go. And he did that when he washed the disciples' feet in an act of service which they struggled at the time to comprehend. The very great Lord and Master himself demonstrated perfectly the principle of self-sacrifice, or agape. And he was now leaving that legacy to his disciples. And after such a demonstration, Jesus could make his own example of self-sacrifice a fundamental principle to be followed, not if one felt like it, not like in Israel, not an option, but by a new command. And so a fundamental principle in the lives of Jesus' disciples, ourselves included, is stated clearly in our final quotation in Romans 12 verse 1, which says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God,